Most speeches that you will hear on this topic will focus on the middle portion, protecting and preserving extraterrestrial microbial life, while discussing ethical obligations and international law only by name, and even then without questioning them. Most speakers will discuss, and rightfully so, the potential benefits that this microbial life can bring to humanity, or how we don't have these obligations towards similar life on Earth, so they shouldn't exist for extraterrestrial life. All of these are extremely important points to discuss. My worry is that this discussion will take for granted the issues at the beginning and end of our topic, overriding ethical obligations and international law. Today, I will negate the topic for two reasons. First, by questioning the idea of overriding ethical obligations generally, and second, by arguing that even if they do exist, their inclusion in international law is not desirable. First, the idea of an overriding ethical obligation raises more questions than it can possibly answer. Adding the word overriding must have been intentional to emphasize that this obligation comes before other obligations that may exist. What are the ethical obligations that this one is meant to override? Also, who is this ethical obligation to? The microbial life, humanity in general? French philosopher Jacques Derrida discusses the problem with prescribing ethical obligations towards someone or something outside of yourself, also called the other, in his book The Gift of Death. Derrida says that by accepting, or in this case prescribing, an overriding ethical obligation to do something, you are doing so at the expense of an infinite amount of other things equally deserving of such an ethical obligation. This inherently exclusionary nature of ethical obligations belies its self-contradiction. The assumption is that fulfilling an ethical obligation makes one an ethical actor, yet, as Derrida explains, as soon as I enter into a relation with the call of the other, I know that I can respond only by sacrificing ethics, that is, by sacrificing whatever obliges me to also respond in the same way to all the others. This is not trivial to this topic, given the emphasis placed on the ethical obligation by using the word overriding. However, this is not to say that individuals should not strive to live ethical lives, but rather we should avoid using language of obligation or duty in ethical discussions. But perhaps you disagree or think I'm being semantic. Well, that brings me to my next point, which is that the incorporation of ethical obligations into international law is misguided and dangerous. Of course, much international law rests on ethical foundations. Many international agreements and treaties exist in response to a shared understanding of ethics that views things like environmental destruction, human trafficking, and genocide as fundamentally unethical. My argument is not that law should not be ethical, but rather that ethical obligations, if they do exist, should not be codified in international law. The topic suggests something radical. Currently, international law prescribes certain acts or behaviors which certainly have ethical implications without mandating such an obligation. For example, the UN Declaration of Human Rights says, "The General Assembly proclaims this declaration as a common standard for all peoples and all nations to the end that every organ of society shall strive to promote respect for these rights and freedoms." Shall strive to promote. There is no ethical condemnation for those who do not achieve the goals. There is simply a call to strive to achieve them. Moreover, while discussing the incorporation of ethics into international law, Boldazar and Koronin, both graduates from Harvard Law School, say, quote, "Such shared operating principles often involve a union between is and ought, where oughtness is given salience without fixing what the ought is, and without determining its precise relation to the is, thereby maintaining the possibility of a claim to universality." End quote. This universality is an essential component of international law due to its multicultural and diasporic nature. Imposing a largely Western notion of an ethical obligation on the international community is both unprecedented and misguided. I hope that I've caused you to think about and reflect on this topic in a new way. Failure to take a step back and consider the philosophical foundations of the questions that we are tasked with answering could have unintended consequences like those outlined above.